In the autumn of 1907, in a valley town so small it didn't have its own post office, a freight wagon rolled up to the edge of a widow's property and dumped 12,000 pounds of rotting peaches onto her land. No warning, no apology, just a note nailed to her fence post. Property of Belhaven Cannery Co. Consider this a courtesy. It wasn't a courtesy. It was a punishment, and it was about to become the best thing that ever happened to her. The valley folks called her Widow Calloway, though her name was Ruth. She was 34 years old, and she'd buried her husband Elias 2 winters back after a logging accident took him. A beam, a bad chain, and 11 seconds nobody could take back. What Elias left her wasn't much. 40 acres of hillside land, half of it too rocky to plow, a farmhouse with a leaning porch, and a mortgage held by the Belhaven Cannery Company, the same company that ran nearly every orchard contract in the valley. Ruth had been growing peaches for the cannery for 3 seasons. Good ones. Contract grade. But this year, something had shifted. The cannery's new manager, a sharp-suited man named Cyrus Thorne, had taken over operations that spring, and Thorne had a habit the old manager never had. He found reasons to reject fruit, bruised skin, wrong size, insufficient blush, reasons that shifted from week to week, batch to batch, reasons that always seemed to land hardest on the smaller growers, who couldn't afford to argue. Ruth had heard whispers about it at the feed store. Old man Hutchins had lost half his contract the same way. So had the Pruitt brothers. Rejected fruit didn't go to waste, though. Thorne had it hauled off and dumped, usually on the grower's own land, to save cannery costs, his notes always said. It was, everyone understood without saying it aloud, a message: fall in line or get buried in your own failure. Ruth had no idea, standing on her porch that October morning, staring at a small mountain of peaches rotting in the October sun, that she was about to become the reason the message stopped working. The peaches sat for 4 days. Ruth didn't touch them at first, partly out of shock, partly out of a stubborn refusal to give Thorne the satisfaction of seeing her panic. But by the 4th day, the smell had become a living thing. It rolled down the hillside into the yard, into the kitchen, into her hair, no matter how many times she washed it. Wasps had arrived by the thousands. Her hens wouldn't go near the coop. It was her neighbor, a quiet older woman named Agnes Pruitt, herself a widow, herself rejected by the cannery that same season, who came walking up the lane with a wagon and 2 barrels and said the thing that changed everything. "You know," Agnes said, staring at the reeking pile, "my mother used to say a peach, 2 days past its prime, makes better cider than one picked clean. Something about the sugars breaking down." Ruth looked at her. "Cider? Peach brandy? More like it, if you're feeling bold, or just cider, if you're not." Agnes shrugged. "Either way, it's a sight better than letting it feed the wasps." Ruth almost laughed. Almost. Instead, something colder and more deliberate moved through her. The particular clarity that comes to a person who has already lost everything they were afraid of losing. "Help me get the good ones separated," she said, "before the frost comes." What followed was 3 weeks of the hardest labor Ruth had done since her husband died. She and Agnes worked from dawn until the light gave out, sorting through the pile by hand, pulling out the peaches that were merely bruised, not yet spoiled, and hauling them to Ruth's old cider press, a relic that had sat unused in the barn since Elias's father's time. It didn't go smoothly. The press's wooden gears had warped from disuse and cracked on the 2nd day, forcing Ruth to ride 4 hours to the county seat for a blacksmith who could fashion new parts, money she didn't have, paid for with the last of her husband's life insurance. There was a night, the 11th night, by Ruth's count, when a storm rolled through the valley and flooded the low corner of the barn where the fermenting barrels sat. Ruth waded through ankle-deep water at 2 in the morning, hauling barrels to higher ground by lantern light, terrified that a single cracked stave would mean 3 weeks of labor lost to the mud. Not one barrel was lost, but Ruth would later say that night aged her more than the 2 years of widowhood before it. By the time the fermentation had properly taken, nearly a month later, Ruth had 60 gallons of peach cider fermenting into something between a hard cider and a light brandy wine, and Thorne had entirely forgotten the widow whose land he'd used as a dumping ground. He would remember her again soon enough. The first 60 gallons weren't meant to be sold. Ruth had simply wanted to salvage something, enough to prove to herself, if no one else, that Thorne's cruelty hadn't broken her. But cider, it turns out, has a way of traveling faster than reputation. Agnes brought a jug to her cousin's wedding in December. Within a week, 3 separate families had walked up Ruth's lane, asking if the widow Calloway had more of that peach drink. By January, a tavern keeper in the next town, a gruff, skeptical man named Whit Doggett, who ran the only public house within 12 miles, rode out personally to taste it. He bought 4 barrels on the spot, cash. It wasn't the money that mattered most, not yet. It was the moment right after the sale closed, when Doggett squinted at Ruth on her porch and asked, almost as an afterthought, "This, the Cannery reject fruit? The Belhaven dump?" Ruth hesitated. Word had clearly already traveled, perhaps not the full details, but enough of the shape of the story that Doggett had pieced it together himself. "It is," she said. Doggett grinned, slow and sharp. "Then you tell folks that. Don't hide it. There's not a soul in this valley who doesn't know Thorne's been squeezing growers dry all season. You put Cannery reject cider on the label, and I promise you, half this county will buy it just to spite him." It was, Ruth would later admit, the single best piece of business advice she ever received, and it came from a tavern keeper who'd known her for all of 20 minutes. Cyrus Thorne was not a stupid man. Cruel, calculating, protective of his margins, but not stupid. And by February, he had begun hearing a name he didn't like in the same sentence as his canneries. Calloway Cider House. It started as a rumor at a supplier meeting, someone joking that the reject peaches from Belhaven's own dump pile were now fetching a better reputation than half the cannery's actual product. Thorne laughed it off at first. He stopped laughing when he rode past Ruth's land in March and saw something he hadn't expected, a hand-painted sign nailed to her fence, the very same fence post where his courtesy note had once hung, reading, beneath it, smaller, "Ask for it at Doggett's Tavern." Thorne's foreman would later describe the manager's expression as the look of a man who'd just watched his own trap spring shut on his hand. Thorne did what men like him do when embarrassed. He escalated. He sent a formal letter to Ruth, accusing her of commercial slander for the sign's wording, threatening legal action if she didn't remove it. It was, without question, the second worst decision of his career. Ruth did not have money for lawyers. What she had, instead, was Agnes Pruitt's nephew, a young law clerk apprenticing in the county seat, eager to make a name for himself and none too fond of the cannery that had also rejected his uncle's fruit 2 seasons running. The clerk's advice was simple. Don't remove the sign, publish the letter. So Ruth did something bold for a widow in 1908, with no formal education past the 8th grade. She wrote a response, not to Thorne, but to the county newspaper. She laid out, plainly and without embellishment, the timeline of events, the dumped peaches, the note nailed to her fence, the 3 weeks of labor to save what she could, and now, a cease and desist letter threatening her for telling the truth about where her cider came from. She closed the letter with a single line that the paper's editor would later say sold out that week's print run. "I did not choose to go into the cider business. Mr. Thorne chose it for me. I only chose to succeed at it." The story ran on a Thursday. By Saturday, Whit Doggett couldn't keep Calloway cider in stock. By the following month, 2 more taverns in neighboring counties had placed standing orders. Thorne, humiliated and now facing whispered accusations from other growers, who felt emboldened to speak up about his rejection practices, quietly withdrew the legal threat and never mentioned Ruth Calloway's name again in public. Success, Ruth would learn, came with its own kind of danger, the danger of growing faster than you're prepared for. By the autumn of 1908, orders had outpaced her single cider press by a wide margin. She faced a decision that kept her up at night: borrow money to expand and risk the very kind of debt that had made her vulnerable to men like Thorne in the first place, or stay small, safe, and slow. She chose a third option, one nobody had suggested to her. She partnered with Agnes and 3 other widows in the valley, women who had, in one form or another, all been squeezed out by the cannery's practices, pooling their land, their labor, and what little capital they had into a single cooperative cidery. No single bank loan, no single owner who could be threatened or bought out. 4 women, 4 small parcels of land, one shared press, and a business structure that made Ruth Calloway impossible to intimidate twice. It was, by any measure, an unusual arrangement for its time. And it worked precisely because no one part of it could be broken without breaking all of it. By 1910, 3 years after 12,000 pounds of rejected peaches had been dumped on her land as an act of cruelty, the Callaway Cider House Cooperative was producing over 4,000 gallons annually, distributed across 6 counties, with a standing wholesale contract that, adjusted for what it represented in that valley's economy, would today be valued well into 6 figures. Cyrus Thorne left Belhaven Cannery in 1911. Following a quiet internal investigation into his rejection practices, sparked, in part, by growers who'd finally found the courage to speak up after watching Ruth Calloway refuse to be crushed. Ruth never sold the cooperative. She ran it until her late 60s, and the cider house, under different ownership, was still operating in that valley, more than 4 decades later. Narrator: Cyrus Thorne dumped 12,000 pounds of rotten fruit on a widow's land, expecting it to bury her. Instead, it became the foundation she built everything on. Sometimes the cruelest thing a person does to you turns out to be the exact material you needed, if you're stubborn enough and patient enough to turn it into something they never saw coming.